Thanks a lot for the invitation. So as a disclaimer, because the talk will be probably very different from what you've heard before, but I'm a philosopher, but yet I've myself done my PhD in philosophy on the architecture of the web. Philosophy on architecture of the web basically was an exegesis of Roy Fielding's thesis, for those of you who know about REST. So, and I've been working like 15 years in the tech domain. I was the initiator of the French DBpedia, for those of you who remember the web of data, semantic web, stuff like that. And I've shifted to different areas, but I also was a co-author of a report. It was published in 2018, I think translated the year after, and there's a problem with the slides. Duplicates? Yeah. Okay, no problem. Which was dedicated to digital sobriety. Called digital sobriety, maybe digital frugality will have been better, but anyway. So I have still have somehow food in tech domain, but I've been mainly working on environmental issues from, let's say, 2014 up until now. So I will introduce you to some of the work I've been doing. And, well, I'm trying to advance a position that will be technocritical but non-reactionary at the same time. I think in the program it said non-conservative, but really it's non-reactionary, so it's maybe stronger than that. In the morning, I kept this slide because the advertised my presentation has addressing the issue of French young engineers who are deserting and trying to do something else than being engineers, and the whole revolt of these engineers. A lot of them said things about that during the summer, but I've written about that, but that won't be the topic of my talk today. But if you have questions about that, you're welcome to ask me. So, just say a few things about the framework within which we're working with my colleagues. We call it ecological redirection. Redirection is a word that comes from Australian designer Tony Fry, someone who's been working on environmental issues for a lot of time. Ecological redirection, to put it in a nutshell, is a framework, both conceptual and operational. That's a very important point. That's just not concepts or whatever. It's very practical, as you will probably see, which is designed to bring public and private organizations and infrastructure and management tools that support them within planetary boundaries. I'm not actually entirely happy with this characterization, but that will do for the moment. I've been myself developing a notion for the past 5 years, even more actually, which is notion of negative commons. Again, to put it in a nutshell, I don't want to be too long, even though I have more time. I don't want to bother you. I don't want you to flee again. I mean, but that's the notion of negative commons. What is mean negative commons? You probably know about the notion of the commons from the work of Elinor Ostrom. Of course, in digital field, we know the common through free software, open source software, and things like that. If you don't absolutely have no idea about the commons, please raise your hand. Okay, no idea. Okay, so to put it again very quickly, the commons designates, let's say, it's a very bad characterization, I think, but it's a very handy one. Resources that are managed by a community which gives itself rules of governance to manage the said resource. Right. So there are three elements. There's a resource, there is a community, and democratic rules to manage the resource. And it comes as an alternative to both private property and public property. There are things that exist not by being owned by anyone, but they are managed as commons. Wikipedia doesn't belong to anyone, and it's managed by a community that gives itself the rules for participating, contributing to Wikipedia. That's just one example. It was basically used to like designate pieces of land that didn't belong to anyone in the Middle Ages, and you got the peasants with the animals feeding on the grass. But then later, it became obvious that the same concept of commons was usable to designate digital technologies or digital realities, digital assets, let's say it like that. So the commons are often, and were often in the past years, put forward as a kind of solution to all the problems that we have. And there was a book published by an author coming from Belgium, Michel Bouwens, from the Peer-to-Peer Foundation. I think it was in 2015, something like that. And it was modestly entitled Saving the World. And that was a book about the commons. And that was kind of the problem, to say that the commons will just save the world as a solution to everything. And at that time, I was myself contributor to the commons in a third place near Lyon, in Villeurbanne, called La Myne, M-Y-N-E. And I was wondering whether it was a fair presentation of the commons, like saving everyone, everything. That's a heavy burden to put on anyone's shoulder, say that you will save the world through your job. And I was reflecting that maybe the commons were not a solution to what has become known as the Anthropocene. You mentioned it. Thanks again for that. But maybe that the commons had to be rethought in the Anthropocene, that we won't just inherit nice commons, bucolic commons, commons that we have to avoid, for which we have to avoid over-exploitation, but that we will also inherit, well, negative commons. Like, should I say, well, infrastructure that have been abandoned, rivers, depleted soils, polluted soils, depleted rivers, and things like that. Stuff that no one wants to take care of, but that will multiply, are already multiplying, and will multiply in the future. Those are the negative commons that are quite obvious, but maybe there are some other negative commons. I left my phone here, but I took this example of the smartphone because we just published in March a book with two colleagues, Laurent Salin and Nicolas Nova, about the smartphone, because the smartphone is also a symbol of the exploitation of workers, of the people who are mining for the ore that makes it possible to create a smartphone. And it's really quite horrible. At the same time, it's a very interesting technology, widespread. So what do we do with these technologies? Also, because the smartphone lasts for like 2 years, we use it for 2 years, and then it becomes a waste for like millennia, even more than that. What a physicist, again from Belgium, making up for your loss, has dubbed zombie technology. Zombie technology because somehow it's already dead, because we're using ore and it's a non-renewable resource, so it's already dead. We know that we won't have this technology for millennia, so in the long run it won't be there. And it's also a zombie because it has a hard time dying. It cannot die like the zombie himself. As a waste, it's not digested by the earth. It's not composted, you know. It's not part of any biogeochemical cycle. And that's, of course, a big problem. So what do we do with these elements that are parts of vision of the future and parts of vision of the problems, the ecological problems we have, and of a dire lack of sustainability? So these are things I call negative commons, and the point is to maybe politicize these realities in order to give them a different trajectory. Because if the world is full of negative commons, well, then we have a problem. Of course, some of them are physical. I've mentioned most of them physical, but there are some more, let's say, abstract negative commons. That could be economic models, management models, and things like that. So, starting from there, I think there is one big question that needs to be raised. It's the main political question for me, actually. And this question is, what do we do with what we inherit, with this legacy of negative commons, technologies which are maybe very useful for some people, more and more people, but at the same time quite unsustainable, infrastructures that were not fit for maybe the Anthropocene, that triggered, and models that did trigger the Anthropocene. But to which we are collectively attached. The we is always problematic, but I will say it's a we nevertheless, both in the global north and in the global south, where there are also some technologies and stuff. So what do we do if we're attached in the short run to these models, infrastructures, technologies that we cannot maintain in the middle run? We're attached in the short run. We cannot maintain them in the middle run, otherwise that will be too problematic regarding the conditions of inhabitability of the Earth. So what do we do between these two issues? And the point is to precisely find a political ridgeline between the two to avoid both traps. We cannot let go of everything at once, but we cannot maintain everything all the same. So what do we do between these two problems? And that's, for me, again, that's the main political question right now. Sorry. To illustrate this point and the kind of world we're in and the kind of situation we're in, I'd like to just mention two elements. One is the name of Sir William Crookes. I don't know if you know about him. As a British scientist of the 19th century, early 20th century. And in 1898, he predicted the generalization of famines due to the lack of available nitrogen to maintain or increase yields. He said in the future, in the 30s, people will die of famine for that reason. And 15 years later, the Haber-Bosch process was invented, which made it possible to, well, maintain and increase the yields. And we kind of depend, the 8 billion people in the world depend on that kind of process, even though maybe in the long run it's a problem for the sustainability of yields and of the soils. But it's a kind of world we're in, and we cannot just shift to something different all at once. And there is this book by Charles Mann. Charles C. Mann is a scientific journalist, I think a US scientific journalist. And he published a book in 2018 entitled The Wizard and the Prophets. And it's about Norman Borlaug and William Vogt. Borlaug is his ideal of the wizard. He is someone who made possible the Green Revolution, and the fact that we are now 8 billion people. And William Vogt was someone more that will be nowadays probably attuned to the degrowth movements. He was someone predicted that there will be a problem, that there were limits, we had to respect those limits, while Borlaug tried to overcome the limits. And it was kind of dialogue between the two. They were not really on friendly terms. And the issue is that the problem is not to choose between the wizards and the prophets, because it's not an ideological choice. That will be easy, but that's not the situation we're in. We're dealing with a world that has been built a lot by the wizards, and we cannot just switch to the prophets. Or it will be possible in kind of Malthusian way, and that's part of what Vogt had in mind. But that's not my option. I'd like us to stay 8 billion and not to work on this parameter first. We cannot only, as I said, switch to prophets. We have to exercise I don't know how you will translate it in English, droit d'inventaire. Like do the inventory work, right? On this world, and choose, decide, politicize what we have to shut down, to close, and what we have to maintain in the future to go towards a viable but probably impure world. I will say what I mean by impure world. What we're working on is not going back to nature, because it's probably too late to go back to a pristine state of nature. But we have to deal with what we call, I call an ecology of impure environments. That our environment is much composed of technical elements, what people call the technosphere. There are indeed the planetary boundaries, and we should remain inside these boundaries, but at the same time we've built a huge technosphere, and even if we stay inside the boundaries, technosphere will not disappear. So what do we do with it? Can we make it degrow? Can we make it more efficient? Can we do both? That's, of course, a big issue, which is both a political and a technical issue. And let's do that by staying, again, 8 billion people. Maybe we'll reach 11 billion, but after that, that will stabilize. You know, some countries, even big countries in the coming decades, will lose half of their population. So this idea that the big problem will be world population is overflated, but anyway. It's, I think, the only common point I have with Elon Musk. He believed that, but he says we should repopulate. That's going a bit too much, but anyway. I love this meme. I really like it because I think it embodies some of the pitfalls we're facing now. So it hasn't been authored by anyone I know, by any political commentator, any political scientist, any philosopher, intellectual. It was born out of the internet. Probably there's someone behind that, but we'll never know who exactly it is, or we have to really do a severe inquiry. So it has horizontal and vertical axis. So upwards, that's the free will axis. Downwards, the destiny axis. To the left, that's the decelerate to nature axis. And to the right, that's the accelerate technology axis. And kind of represent some of the pitfalls, again, we are facing now. On the to the left and up side of the screen, you've got the eco-fascist global genocide left. The kind of left with comments that will require that, again, the population be diminished a lot so that we can fit inside the natural limits. And of course, it's not very sympathetic. So the eco-fascist here means the free will aspect, like we have to reduce population voluntarily. The one on the downside is the Malthusian correcting collapse left. We had a big collapse movement in France. I don't know if you're aware of that, but in the years 2015, I'm not saying they were all in the same, sharing the same position as the one that is depicted here, but there's this idea that nature will do its part, and that thanks to collapse, global collapse, the population will reach limits, like, I don't know, 300 millions of people or something like that, and that will fit inside the planetary boundaries thanks to this correction. I don't think these positions are nice positions. You know, I think these are positions that are somehow there in the debates we have in ecology, and that we should be wary of them. And to the right, there is more something, maybe it talks to the tech workers, like the one upside is the Summon AI God extinction rights, like summon artificial intelligence that will kill everyone and everything. And the one below is the transhumanism, nihilism, singularity rights, the one that will simply lead to this kind of singularity that will do the job, but that will not be summoned by and controlled by anyone. So I think we have to, again, not choose between these positions, but find a kind of, again, ridgeline that help us avoid all these pitfalls, which are very tangible somehow. That's just not a meme aspect here. Okay, I won't talk about that. I will talk about that instead. The question I wanted to raise in terms of action is also a question, I'm coming to it, a question of reparation, not repair. In the French conference on la Tech in the morning, we had a repair talk by Jérôme Denis, just published a book about repair and maintenance studies, very important fields. You will see that I'm going to talk about shutting things down, closing things, But it's not in the sense here of the repair studying. Repair and reparation are two different words in English, same word in French, actually. What I would like to suggest is to think about the stakes of distribution in connection with an imperative of justice. And I'm alluding to the way reparation is used, for example, in the work of Nigerian-American philosopher Olufemi Taiwo, who's talking of the movement of reparation of descendants from people enslaved that are seeking reparation. And he says that we somehow have to inherit what he calls the global racial empire that was, the result of colonization, slavery, things like that, and that made the current world possible with its distribution of opportunities, riches, resources, and the likes. And that we have to inherit it to unravel some of its fundamentals, unravel some of the ways precisely resources are distributed in this global racial empire. So for him, reparation is not first and foremost a simple compensation, whether it is financial or symbolic, for the past, for what happened. But it's a way of transforming a system that we inherit in order not to let it go on as it is. He says, I quote, "What if building the just world was reparation? Changing the way things operate is the way for reparation." And that's a very important point, because distribution is also what some researchers in the field of environmental studies diagnose as the one aspect that will help us fight against the consequences of not just climate change, but climate change, the fixed extinctions, and everything that has to do with crossing the planetary boundaries. And actually some researchers have said in some studies 2 years ago or something, Julia Steinberger and some people in her team, that we could, by fighting the inequalities, so by tackling the issue of distribution, that will be a very effective means to fight against climate change and associated problems. So putting more justice in the system we inherit from, dismantling it somehow in order to create a system that will be more just. So how do we do what I called redirection? Unlike other approaches like green growth, corporate social responsibility, sustainable development, ecological redirection has a different starting point by saying that we cannot inherit what we inherit and maintain everything. We cannot just maintain everything that we have and make it simply more efficient or greener. That is necessary, but making things more efficient will not be sufficient. Just like frugality will not be sufficient. Generally, we oppose the two, which is a bit of a problem, because if you only have frugality or if you only have efficiency, you have a problem. So we have to work on all these aspects and probably dismantle some of the stuff which are unsustainable for the future. So we need some arbitrations. And how do we do that? How do we decide what we keep, what we abandon, and what we carefully shut down? And our work is precisely all about that. And I generally distinguish between 3 criteria to achieve these arbitrations in good conditions. The first one is to have arbitrations which are democratic versus authoritarian. There are lots of arbitrations going on in lots of countries, but generally, most generally, they are not democratic. They are imposed, and of course that is a big problem. Again, generally they are not anticipated, but they are realized at the last moment. And this goes back to the previous criterion, because if you do things, take measures at the last time, you realize them at the last moment, chances are the process won't be democratic at all. And the last criterion, which is probably for me the most important of the 3, is to make arbitrations in a non-brutal fashion against a brutal fashion. What it means here, go to the next slide, is that we have to carefully map the attachment of the people who are concerned by the realities linked to the realities that will be shut down, dismantled, closed, etc. we have to inquire and map on these attachments, map those attachments, because that's a way to understand what is at stake behind these arbitration, to take that into account. When I'm talking about attachment, I'm not talking about only mental attachment, affective attachment, but like vital attachment for the subsistence of these people. And that's a condition to do some disattachment. I prefer this notion because in French I'm talking of désattachement instead of détachement, detachment, which has a sort of Buddhist kind of flavor, which I don't like to talk about that. So disattachment, it's how do we create the protocols that allows people, organizations, whatever, collective, to disattach themselves from realities that have no future, like what I call obsolete futures, or reality that shouldn't have any future because they are destroying the inhabitability of the world. Two different, actually, cases. And to do that, we have eventually to propose some ways for the people affected by these realities to reattach themselves to something, because you cannot live without any attachment. It's not possible. And that's one of the problems of ecology. You say, we will take that away from you, but what are people offered instead? Are they offered new ways of subsistence, new modes of subsistence? Generally not. So how do we produce and create these modes of subsistence with the people that are concerned by these attachments, these attachments? So investigating attachments in order to bring out new criteria for these attachments makes it possible to operate these attachments in a just fashion by taking in account issues of justice. If you don't have criteria, you cannot raise the issue of justice. So that's a very important point. So what do we do about that? Well, we are trying to design arts of closures, especially in the global north, for some of the stuff we have built over the last centuries, to know how to carefully disattach ourselves from some of the things if they have no future. So there is, of course, a lot of work about innovation. There is more and more work about repair, like the repair studies I mentioned. There is a lot of work now about maintenance, the importance of maintenance, and that's very interesting to focus on something else, that innovation. There is no innovation without repair and maintenance, but there is very little work about how things end, how things should end, how we have to take care of these, how we have to dismantle them in a careful way, how we have to shut them down. There is no practical knowledge about that, very little theoretical knowledge about that, and that's precisely what we are working on, to fill this void. So for example, this is a fresque. In France, there are fresques about everything. You have to know that. So it's not really a fresque, actually, but it's called a fresque for that reason. But anyway, I was not the inventor, but I plead guilty nevertheless. It's the fresque of renouncements. So it's a kind of tool that helps people, organizations, institutions feel, experiment what it will mean to seriously renounce, dismantle something in a careful fashion. If you know that you have an activity that has no future, and a lot of companies know that, something that is called by economists stranded assets, for example, but generally economists say you have to just divest from stranded assets, but behind this divestment there are people, jobs, attachments. That's not the job of the economist to care for that. That's more my job, and no one's really doing that right now. But it concerns all the sectors, really everyone. So it's giving a taste of what it will mean to this kind of inquiry into renunciation. It's not just theoretical, as I said. It's not mainly theoretical at all. These are some of the past, current, and future projects we've been working on. On a yearly basis, so I'm the head of a diploma, post-diploma in France, hosted by both management school and the design school. It's entitled Strategy and Design for the Anthropocene. And we're precisely training students, some of them are grown-ups, in ecological redirection, in working on these, on some commissions that reflect what I've been talking about. So, for example, we've been working with companies who advise other companies in the field of construction in order to study how we could shift from an economy of building to an economy of maintenance and rehabilitation in the field, so as not to build anymore in the future, in France at least. The result of that is that it will be more or less possible, very good for the environment, but there are lots of consequences. How do we do with the asset economy? How do we really shift from this one economy to the other? What do we do with architecture schools if architects in the future are not there to build but to maintain and rehabilitate? Look at what's happening now. Architects are not advertising themselves as people who are doing maintenance or rehabilitation, but as builders, right? So it's a kind of interesting to look at here at the micro level what it reveals at the macro level. So and it's a company that wanted us to work on this aspect because it's had the intuition, even more than that, the knowledge that the field itself will shift to a different economy in the coming years, and it was not ready. And indeed, 2 years ago, people from the field said, we know we have to stop building, but we won't be able to do it. But we know it, but it's not possible. 2 years later, the conversation has really shifted a lot. And now it's much more mainstream to talk about that. What will be great will be not just talking about it, but now precisely look at what's necessary to really shift from one economy to the other. Very concretely, to have the tools do that, to have the economy do that, to have the business models do that. And it was kind of very theoretical 2 years ago, and now we're working with a company in the sector, in the industry. I can't name this company because I've signed an NDA, but it's trying to look at its business model and integrate the fact that probably in the future there will be no longer construction but a different economy. So it's very, very concrete. On a yearly basis, we're working with companies, public bodies, I won't name them all here, but around like 15 to 20 of similar commissions, very concrete ones. Some involving very small companies, some multinationals, and in all the sectors. So that's kind of my message. It's not just in my mind. It's not just, we were teaching stuff about the Anthropocene because it's fun and we like it. It's that all the sectors, all the companies, they're facing these issues. My colleague, Emmanuel Bonnet, he's working with ski resorts who are facing their end, at least in France. And he said to the vice president of a company of the CAC 40 in France, a big company, that it did not only the lack of snow is, a problem with the future of the ski resorts. It's not just a small problem, it's a big problem, it's a vital problem. It's not just the snow, it's the permafrost that is so melting, it's becoming very dangerous to be there anyway. And the response of this VP was, after a moment of silence, he said, well, I see very well where the snow is in my organization. Like the basis that allows my organization to thrive is melting. What happens? That's a question for everyone. So, recapitulating some stuff I said, we have a movement in France of people very critical of technology, saying we have to abandon technology because, of course, technology is part of a problem. I've been trying to show that the situation is more complicated than that. We don't choose the world we're in. We're in a world where we depend as much on technosphere as we depend on nature, and we kind of just say, well, we'll shift from technosphere to nature. 8 billion people, that's bullshit. Simple as that. It's too simple diagnosis. And the thing is, a lot of these people who become technocritical, they begin reading technocritical authors, philosophers, and stuff, supposedly radical people. Radical, but very theoretical at the same time, so not exactly radical somehow. But anyway, I won't diss them, not too much. And I realized that I know some of these people, and not a long time ago during the summer, one of those, I won't say who that was, but he was publishing on his Facebook that after a long time thinking about it, he realized that, so he was defecting from his jobs, former engineer, field of research, blah, 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 read the right kind of technocritical author, and his conclusion, his contribution to changing the world was that I've realized that a man is a man and a woman is a woman. Go fuck yourself. That's my only answer. Please stay an engineer. Stay a fucking engineer. Keep your fucking job. And please don't desert. Don't become technocritical. Don't add evil to an already difficult situation. Right? That's my only answer to that kind of things. So broke, becoming technocritical to attack trans people, very bad. The woke side of thing, reorienting your capital and assets as engineers, tech workers, and all who have privilege, but let's use those to do something and change something about the situation the global racial empire have been talking about to support redirection strategies. From a moral perspective, political perspective, strategic perspective, reorienting your assets just to criticize or threaten trans people, that's unworthy. There are lots of good stuff to be done, so let's discuss that. The job we're trying to do, and I'll finish about that, is that we're trying precisely to see what those strategies can be. Trying to propose a kind of framework where issues of ecological redirection, shutting things down, looking in the future, the Anthropocene, where it becomes possible for institutions and organizations to seize upon this framework and address some of their more pressing issues that they cannot address by themselves. If you ask a company, how would you just shut down yourself? Carefully, generally don't know what to do. How can you shift to something completely different from what you used to do? They don't have the tools to do that, even if they wanted to do that. So we have to build these tools, build this kind of knowledge, and what we're trying to do is trying to look at what will happen in the future, the kind of trouble we will be in the future. We'll try to extract these situations to provide answers. I'm not saying solution, to provide answers in the present, to generalize those answers before these problems, these problematic situations are generalized, before we face them violently and forcefully, right? And if you're interested in what we're doing, we have some publications. So this is our diploma, post-diploma, some guide about the ecological redirection. That's the logo from the city hall of the town of Bordeaux. I know it looks like a biohazard logo, but that's not the case. We're not radioactive. And we published a book 1.5 years ago entitled Héritage et fermeture, une écologie du démantèlement. Legacy and Closure, an ecology of dismantling, myself, Emmanuel Bonnet, and Diego Ondivar, and that's the advertising point, blatant one. I'm publishing a new book about precisely what I've been talking about today, which is entitled Politicizing Renunciation. Thank you very much for listening, staying there.
Just taking my breath back. So that was a lot. Any questions? Any comments? Yeah, let's go, Antoine. I told you. That was not the average technical speech.
Hi, thank you, and a great talk. A lot of what you say resonates with what I read in the PTEC, the transformation plan for the French economy from the Shift project, especially like the idea that we have to make sacrifices and renounce to what we currently have. Like, as an example, I think in the PTC they talk about you should avoid driving if you're going to do less than 7 kilometers and use a bike instead. And I wonder, like, it's going to be very difficult for people to do so, to give up on what they had. Do you think it's possible?
Well, yeah, I think it's possible not as external imperative, like you have to do it. That will not work. If it's a kind of eco imperative, that will not do. But that if doing politics becomes deciding what you keep and what you let go of and the transformation that it involves, then it is possible. And one of the conditions for that, which I've been quickly talking about, that's also a condition for frugality, what we call sobriété in French. And there have been lots and lot of horrible talk about sobriété during the past year. One of the conditions behind sobriété, frugality, is fighting inequalities. If you wish for frugality without fighting inequalities, that's a recipe for civil war. So yeah, we have to do politics in different fashion, and we have first and foremost to fight against inequalities. I think that's one of the main aspects if we want to really tackle the issue of climate change and associated issues. Yeah. Regarding just what you said, I will add just something that is, there is no one-size-fits-all answer to the issue. And I wouldn't say that, for example, people with a disability, different bodies and stuff need to be subjected to the same kind of imperative as those you mentioned. So we also have to make rooms for different people, different bodies, different forms of life somehow.
Thank you very much for your talk. So I have two quick questions. The first one, I wanted to hear you talk about resiliency and how do you make the concept of renouncement and resiliency match together. And my second question is about the multi-level analysis. So you are working in the management field, so your level of, partially. So you have a level of, your level of analysis is organization, but how can you have a multi-level analysis between cities and organization, countries and international level? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for these questions. I won't have any definite answer, of course, but regarding the first aspect, yes, it's very interesting because resiliency is quite a tricky notion. The first thing to say is that generally it's not well defined. It's more used as a catchword, a buzzword these days than a real concept, especially in France, where during the past 2 years, something like that, especially during, I think, the lockdowns, resiliency has become very, very strong. Even inside institutions where they have to use the paradigm of resiliency, even though they don't believe it's the right one, but it's kind of, they're forced to do that without necessarily knowing precisely the story behind the notion. And the situation is very different in the US, where the literature on resiliency is much, much stronger than what we have in France. So I will say it's very problematic because it can become like a way to, it's funny because I don't know if you know about Annette Singh's book, The Mushroom at the End of the World. Okay. So it's about learning to live in the ruins of capitalism. And it's quite interesting. It's showing how people nevertheless cope with difficult situations in ways that are very intricate and interesting. But at the same time, what's the lesson behind that? That we should all learn how to live in the ruins of capitalism, which is basically what resiliency is all about and has become the kind of number one paradigm in the field of crisis management. Where it's more about empowering people who are facing a difficult situation instead of avoiding that situation to happen in the first place. So when I deal, for example, with the notion of negative commons, I try to avoid doing the same thing that resiliency is doing. Resiliency will be, there are people facing difficult problems, situations, crises, whatever. Let's empower them and look at how they fare. Okay. And my answer will be, for the people facing these situations or their causes, will be how can we politicize these situations to make sure that the public that is facing this issue is not just the public that is receiving these bad effects, but also the people responsible, and that we incorporate in the political treatment of the issue both those affected and those responsible. And again, we go back to this issue of justice and repair reparation I've been talking about. So that's a way to differentiate ourselves from these elements. But resiliency is a tricky notion. I'm not for it, but I understand that it's tricky, and we have to delve deeper to understand what is happening in the name of resiliency. Regarding your other point, you're absolutely right. We are more working at the meso level than the macro level or the micro level, because through the meso level we can go upwards and reach sometimes the macro level. We can go downwards and reach the small resiliency level, let's say it that way. It will be difficult to address things at the macro level directly, so we don't necessarily have the, the affordances to do that immediately. So we've resolved more to attack the meso level. But you're right. Generally, it's in the field, especially of ecology, people have a hard time thinking about the macro level and like geopolitical issues and stuff like that, issues of sovereignty and stuff like that. So not to be too long, but I think these are absolutely fundamental, and we should not hide behind our fingers and not address those. Yeah.
In the beginning of your talk, you gave a definition of some designer from Australia who said some principle in which he said that it should remain within the boundaries of the planet. And then you mentioned also degrowth, but I don't know in how far they are coupled, so I would address on the one hand, it's like, what is your stance on degrowth? But I will also make a comment already on this definition, because this was not addressed, but it's a question I have in my mind. Because to me, growth is actually very much part of every living system. So it's a biological principle, actually. If I look into nature, every single living thing strives to grow and multiply itself in a way. So if human beings go outside of the planet, I don't see that as problematic necessarily. I can see that as a very natural way of duplicating system. Even when we now talk about the Anthropocene, maybe that's exactly necessary to even be able to inhabit a planet that is not now ecological. So it needs to be anthropologically made ecological. And is that maybe an angle to even think about it? Because imagine we are able to make Mars livable, then we can also deal with all the catastrophes that come upon us. So, yeah. What's your sense?
Regarding what you just said, I'm not sure the scientists who are working on these fields believe that it's doable. You know, there is, I don't remember the guy who said that's an astrophysicist, I think Neil deGrasse Tyson, who said we should begin by terraforming the Earth instead of terraforming Mars. That is, we can't even achieve that, and so we shouldn't think we would be able to do that on Mars, which seems very impractical, problematic. Also, there's a book that was just published about that, about what kind of freedom we will have on Mars or other planets, because everything will be controlled and privately owned, like the oxygen you're breathing, everything you're doing. There's nothing, has the commons has completely disappeared, and it's owned and controlled by someone, and that's a very tricky situation to live in. So regarding degrowth, at the same time, problem I have with degrowth is that either it's a kind of philosophical movement, and generally it's bad philosophy, unfortunately. To me, that's something I completely assume. And when it's degrowth understood has more economics, it's situated at a very, very macro level, and you don't know what you can do with that. You've got a program, it's a nice program, it's a nice model. It should be discussed democratically, whatever, but it's just one model. How do you make this model land, as Bruno Latour said? What do you do practically with this kind of very abstract model? And I have no real answer about that. So this is also why we're addressing issues at the meso level, because we know we have some traction, we know we have some, we have some affordances to act. I'm not sure it's currently the case with degrowth. And there are some other problems I won't talk about publicly.
Alexandre, do you allow me a question?
Yeah, sure.
I'm going to bounce back on the Mars
Yeah.
question about something that really bothered me since I read Sapiens from Hariri, which is our time frame in our mind. And what I believe, but please correct me if I'm wrong, is that we are experiencing a very short-term crisis which has been created on a very short time frame. I mean, honestly, all this disaster just started just 200 years ago, which is basically nothing. When we started to dig fossil fuel and the Anthropocene, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a super young phenomenon. And so we tend to see, when we go back to what nature will provide us and nature will solve things, etc., it's not the right time scale, because yes, maybe eventually at some point we will reach the level of knowledge or the evolution to be able to understand how a very complex systemic biosystem works and replicate it on other planets. But what I feel today is that we try to bring non-efficient tool because we believe that, this is something that we used to do or that we have like thousands of years ahead of us, but Anthropocene is a very short time frame, isn't it? Am I wrong here or not?
Well, there are some controversies about precisely the time frame, whether it's 2 centuries, even sometimes like 70 years ago or 4 centuries. Some even say it's going back like 13 millennia ago. But generally, yeah, it's like the Industrial Revolution, colonization, slavery, associated phenomena. Thank you for this question, because it allows me to talk a little bit about this slide. I will be brief. Let's say currently there are some people in the intellectual field who are trying to distinguish between different operators to attractors to understand the situation we're in. Some of them talk about the global, what they call the global, meaning the kind of world we live in, the kind of world we believed maybe, but not everyone believed that will be sustainable in the future, will be maintainable in the future, and we now know it's not exactly possible. So let's say the world made possible by industry, capitalism, you choose your main cause. That's not a big problem for me. That's not main interesting points. And some say we have to become terrestrial again. That's what the late Bruno Latour said. We have to make room for non-humans, not just living beings, but all the beings that maintain the world and make the world inhabitable by people, human beings. So how do we make rooms for these, and how do we relate in different fashion to these? Not working. Yeah, going back. So how do we relate to these? How do we relate to these beings? And there is a third notion which I think is very interesting. It has been introduced by different people, including the Indian historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, who's a very interesting author. And he's talking about the planetary. And the planetary is precisely this dimension which goes beyond nature as we understand it, the terrestrial, and which is on a scale that is very difficult to understand and realize. It's on this scale that, for example, oil becomes a renewable resource.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So on our scale, it's not a renewable resource. On the cosmic scale, it's definitely a renewable resource. So what happens on the terrestrial, if you destroy soil, you're in it in deep shit for like millennia, you know? And that's, of course, a big problem. Even if we get rid of problems or issues, we still have these issues of scales that we are facing, unfortunately. If our only problem is capitalism, then the situation is not as dire as it is. An example about that, just to quickly finish to answer your question, is the plants where we keep nuclear waste. as a disclaimer, I'm neither for nuclear power nor against nuclear power. I'm interested in the issues that both the people pro and contra are facing in the future. That's my interest. And they are facing severe issues, whoever they are. But what's interesting is that sometimes there are some projects to, especially in Scandinavia, to keep the nuclear waste for, like in Onkelo, it's famous, there was a film about that, movie about that, to host this waste for like 100,000 years. And that's very interesting because no institution, no human civilization, no language has lasted for 100,000 years. So it's a way for the global, I mean the infrastructure we are building, the technosphere, to scale up to the planetary because it's needed. And we have never done that in the past. Whether it is possible or not remains very controversial, but that's a stretch. Can we really do that? I'm not too sure. So that's an interesting issue.
Definitely. Any last